Mr. Harrison had always been known as the kind of man who worked late into the night, the glow of his office light often being the last one shining in the tall glass building. But on this particular night, as he gathered his papers and prepared to leave, something unusual caught his attention in the long, quiet corridor. There was a faint flicker of light near the janitor's storage room, almost hidden from sight, and curiosity pushed him to follow it, his polished shoes echoing softly against the marble floor, the silence of the building making every step sound louder than it should. And when he reached the corner, he froze because there, sitting cross-legged on the cold tiled floor, under the dim glow of a cheap battery-powered lamp, was a young girl. In the cleaner's uniform, her head bent low over a thick, worn-out textbook with pages marked by creases and scribbles, her lips moving quietly as though she was reading out loud to herself. She was so lost in her world that she did not notice him at first, and Harrison just stood still, his sharp eyes narrowing as questions filled his mind. Why would a cleaner be reading so late at night? Why here? Why in the dark? And why with such desperate focus? When Amina, the cleaner, finally noticed his shadow stretching over her book, she startled, quickly snapping the book shut and standing up, her hands trembling as she clutched the frayed cover, her eyes wide with fear, because, in her heart, she thought she was about to lose the only job that kept food on her family's table. And she stammered, struggling to form words, apologizing for wasting time, insisting she had just wanted a small break. But Harrison's expression was unreadable, his tall frame and expensive suit making him look even more intimidating under the weak light. For a long moment, he said nothing, and the silence between them felt heavy, almost suffocating, as Amina's mind raced with worry, wondering if this one mistake would cost her everything she had been fighting for. And yet there was something, in her eyes, something stubborn, something burning that made Harrison hesitate before speaking, because he saw not laziness or carelessness, but a deep hunger for knowledge, a hunger he vaguely remembered from his own youth when he had studied by candlelight in a small apartment before fortune had changed his life. Finally, he asked her in a voice that was both calm and stern what she was doing, and she lowered her gaze, whispering that she was studying biology, a subject she loved, because she wanted to one day become a doctor, though she quickly added that it was impossible, just a dream she carried in her heart, because her family had no money for proper schooling, and her only chance was to read whenever she could, even if it meant studying in the dark after hours, cleaning during the day, and sacrificing sleep at night. Harrison's chest tightened as he listened, though his face remained hard, his mind conflicted, because in her words he heard echoes of sacrifice, struggle, and determination that reminded him of how cruel the world could be to those born without wealth or opportunity. And though he wanted to dismiss her, something inside him refused to move, holding him in that moment like an anchor, as if fate had brought him there to witness this hidden fight. The sound of the wind pressing against the tall glass windows above made the building groan slightly, breaking the silence, and Amina's fingers nervously twisted the corner of her book, her posture tense as though she expected him to shout or fire her. Yet Harrison only asked a second question, this time softer, almost curious. Why would she risk her job for something so uncertain? Why would she fight so hard when the odds were against her? And her answer came with tears she tried to hide, saying that sometimes dreams were the only light a person had in a life full of darkness. And even if she never reached them, at least she would die knowing she tried. Those words pierced through the shell of indifference Harrison had built over years of wealth and power, shaking something buried deep inside him, though he remained silent, turning his gaze toward the little lamp that flickered like it was about to die, the weak flame of hope fighting against shadows. And in that instant he realized this encounter was no accident, but the beginning of something he did not yet understand, a story that was only just unfolding in the quiet of the midnight corridor. Harrison could not sleep that night. The image of Amina, bent over her book under the dim glow of the dying lamp, kept replaying in his mind like a scene that refused to fade, and though he tried to drown himself in work, the silence of his mansion only made her words echo louder. Dreams are the only light in the dark, and he wondered how many nights she had sat on that cold floor, memorizing pages with tired eyes while most of the city slept. But the more he thought, the heavier the weight grew in his chest, because he knew he had built his empire from nothing, yet had long forgotten the hunger of those early days. When morning came, he arrived at the office earlier than usual, his sharp gaze sweeping the lobby, and though he told himself it was foolish, he kept searching for her face among the staff, wondering if she had returned to the shadows with her broom and mop, hiding the secret of her silent dream. But hours passed with meetings and calls, and still the thought would not leave him, pulling at him like a stubborn thread, until finally, late that evening, he found himself walking toward the storage room again, his heart beating faster, though he could not explain why. And when he opened the door, there she was, sitting in the same place with the same book, her lamp dim but her eyes brighter than ever, her lips whispering words only she could hear. She startled when she saw him, nearly dropping her pen, but before she could apologize again, he raised a hand, stopping her words, and for a long moment they just stared at each other, an invisible tension filling the air. one side carrying authority and wealth, the other carrying fear and fragile hope. Then, in a voice that surprised even himself, Harrison asked her to tell him more about her dream, and Amina, though hesitant, slowly opened up, her words trembling at first, but growing steady as she spoke about how she had always loved science, how she used to sit by the window of her schoolhouse until her family could no longer afford the fees, how her father had fallen ill and her mother worked herself to exhaustion, leaving her to step into the role of provider. Yet no matter how tired she was after cleaning, she carried her books with her, believing that maybe one day she could sit in a classroom again, maybe one day she could put on a white coat and save lives. Because the world needed doctors who understood struggle, not just wealth. Harrison listened without interrupting, his mind shifting with every sentence, and though his face remained unreadable, his heart was stirred by the fire in her voice, because she spoke not of ambition for money or fame, but of a desire to heal, to help, to rise not just for herself but for everyone who believed they were trapped in darkness. And as she finished her story, her eyes dropped to the floor, as if ashamed of dreaming so high, whispering that she knew people like her were not meant for such things, that the world had already chosen who deserved doors to open, and that her fate was simply to sweep the hallways while others walked them with pride. Those words made Harrison's jaw tighten, because he, of all people, knew how cruelly true they sounded, yet he also knew that he had broken through those walls once, though his wealth had blinded him to those still struggling outside. And suddenly, he asked her if she would be willing to study properly if given the chance, and the shock in her eyes was so raw that for a moment she could not breathe. As though he had handed her a key to a locked door she never believed would open, she stammered that she would give everything, every ounce of her strength, if only she could learn, and Harrison, though unsure why he felt compelled, nodded silently before walking away, leaving her standing with her book clutched to her chest, confused and shaken, yet with a spark of hope burning brighter than ever. That night, Harrison sat in his study, staring at his empire laid out in reports and numbers, realizing how cold success felt when it did not change lives beyond his own. And though doubt whispered in his mind, telling him not to interfere, something stronger told him that this was not coincidence, but a test of his own forgotten humanity. Meanwhile, Amina continued her routine, sweeping floors by day and reading by night. But now her heart carried a strange anticipation, a silent question of whether the man who had caught her in her secret dream would ever return. And in that waiting, her determination only grew, because whether or not he helped her, she would still fight, she would still dream, for to stop dreaming was to stop living. But unknown to her, Harrison had already begun making calls, discreet inquiries about schools, scholarships, and ways to lift someone from shadows without drawing unwanted attention. And though he told himself it was just curiosity, deep inside, he knew it was something more, something that felt like destiny pushing him forward. A silent dream, now shared between two unlikely souls, the billionaire who had everything yet felt empty, and the cleaner who had nothing yet carried a light, so strong it could not be ignored. Harrison's decision to secretly help Amina had seemed simple the night he first made it, yet as the days passed, he realized that the real battle was not with money or opportunities, but with the invisible walls that life had built around her, walls of doubt, fear, and society's harsh judgment. And though he had power enough to move mountains, he knew he could not simply lift her without shattering her pride or exposing her to gossip that could crush her spirit. So he kept his intentions hidden, watching quietly from the shadows, learning her routines, her struggles, and even her small victories, like the way her face lit up when she solved the problem in her book, or the way she hummed softly to herself when the hallways were empty, pretending for a moment that she belonged to a world bigger than mops and buckets. Yet the more he observed, the more he saw the unseen battles she fought daily, the sore hands that trembled from long hours of scrubbing floors, the exhaustion she tried to mask with forced smiles, and the cruel whispers from others who mocked her ambition, calling her foolish for carrying books while working in rags. But what cut him deepest was her silence, the way she absorbed every insult without reply, storing them quietly in her heart as if she had grown used to the world telling her she was not enough. And Harrison, a man who once thrived on challenges, now found himself restless, pacing in his office late into the night, struggling with the question of how to give her a chance without destroying the fragile courage she still clung to. And, as fate would have it, the answer came sooner than expected when the company announced a scholarship program for underprivileged students, something Harrison had approved months earlier but never cared to look at until now. And though it was meant for outsiders, he realized he could bend the rules, slipping her name quietly into the pile if only she dared to apply. But when he brought it up casually one evening, suggesting that she look into it, she froze, her eyes wide with fear, whispering that people like her did not belong in such lists, that she could not risk humiliation if she failed. And it was then that Harrison, truly, saw the depth of her unseen battle, not just against poverty but against the invisible chains of her own doubt, chains forged by years of rejection and silence. And he understood that lifting her was not about giving her money or books, but about convincing her to believe in herself enough to reach out. So he left her that night with nothing but a quiet smile and the words, "Sometimes the world waits for the one who dares." And though she said nothing, the phrase echoed in her heart long after he walked away, fighting against the voices of fear that told her to stay small. That week became the hardest of her life. Each night she sat with the scholarship form in her hands, her pen hovering over the paper but never moving, because for every line she wanted to write, a louder voice told her she was wasting her time, that she was just a cleaner, that she did not deserve a future brighter than her past. And in those silent hours she wept quietly, torn between her dream and her fear of failure. But still, she returned to her books each night, as if testing whether she truly had the strength to rise. And Harrison, though never showing it openly, was fighting his own unseen battle too, wrestling with the guilt of knowing that even with all his wealth, he could not hand her courage. He could only wait, hoping she would find it herself. Then came the night he walked past the storage room and saw her still awake at dawn, her eyes red but her hand finally moving across the form, each word written with trembling determination. And when she finished, clutching the paper as if it were a piece of her soul, he knew the battle was far from over, but a victory had been won, for she had dared to fight against her doubt. And though she did not see him standing there, watching silently, his heart swelled with a strange pride, realizing that sometimes the greatest battles are the ones no one else sees, the wars fought in silence. And in that moment, both Harrison and Amina understood that the journey ahead would not be easy, but the first step had been taken, and once the first step is made, the path, no matter how hard, can no longer remain unseen. The day the scholarship results were announced, Amina stood frozen in the corner of the hallway, clutching her cleaning rag so tightly her knuckles turned white, her heart pounding like a drum as names were read aloud from a polished wooden stage where managers and staff had gathered. And though she pretended to scrub the same spot on the floor, her ears strained to catch every word, terrified and hopeful, all at once, until suddenly she heard her own name echo through the speakers, and the world seemed to stop, the rag falling from her hand, her breath caught in her throat, and for the first time in years she felt as though she existed beyond the shadows. Yet that feeling of wonder was quickly tangled with fear, for whispers spread across the room, some clapping politely while others muttered that a cleaner could not possibly deserve such a prize, and though her heart leaped with joy, doubt immediately weighed her down. But then she looked up and saw Harrison standing in the back, his arms crossed, his face calm yet proud, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. And she realized this was not just about a scholarship. It was an unspoken test of courage, a doorway to a future she had always dreamed of but never dared to touch. And that night, as she sat alone in the dim light of the storage room, the papers of the scholarship laid out before her, she realized it was not simply a letter of acceptance. It was an offer to change her life forever. Yet with it came a storm of questions. Was she ready to leave behind the safety of the little world she knew, to step into classrooms filled with people who might laugh at her accent, her clothes, her past, to risk failing in front of those who already expected her to fall? And though the thought of freedom set her heart racing, the thought of shame left her trembling, until Harrison quietly entered the room, holding 2 cups of coffee, and without asking, placed one in front of her, sitting across the table as if he had done it 1,000 times. Then with a steady voice, he told her that the scholarship was only a piece of paper, that what mattered was the choice she made, and that sometimes the hardest thing in life was not winning, but believing that you deserved to win. And those words pierced her heart more deeply than anything she had ever heard. For she had lived so long listening to voices telling her she was less, that she had forgotten how to speak to herself with hope. And as she sat there, tears welling in her eyes, she whispered that she was afraid, not of studying, but of disappointing the one person who had believed in her when no one else did. And Harrison leaned forward, his gaze firm yet kind, telling her that disappointment only came from not trying, that failure was nothing but a step toward strength, and that if she turned away now, she would never know what she could become. And in that moment, the weight inside her shifted, replaced, not with confidence, but with something far greater courage to try, even if she stumbled, and with trembling fingers she signed the final paper, sealing her decision. And Harrison, watching her, knew that a door had opened in her life that no one could close again. And though he said nothing more, the small smile at the edge of his lips told her that the journey was just beginning. And as she tucked the papers into her worn bag, the silence in the room felt different now, no longer heavy with fear, but alive with possibility, a quiet reminder that sometimes a single offer, accepted in the face of doubt, could change everything. The morning of her first day as a university student arrived colder than she expected, with the sky painted in pale gray and the streets still wet from a night of rain. And as Amina walked through the gates with her second-hand backpack clutched tightly against her chest, her heart raced with the sound of footsteps echoing all around, students laughing in groups, cars pulling in, the smell of coffee drifting from the corner cafe. And in that whirlwind of newness, she felt both invisible and exposed, as though every eye might notice her simple clothes, her nervous walk, her hands still carrying faint traces of cleaning soap, no matter how many times she washed them. Yet, she kept moving, whispering to herself that she belonged, repeating Harrison's words like a shield against the doubts that rose inside her. And though every step felt heavier than the last, she pushed forward until she found herself standing in front of a tall building where her first class would be, her reflection caught in the glass door, a young woman who looked uncertain but determined. And in that moment she realized this was not just a building, it was the threshold between who she had been and who she might become. And as the hours passed, sitting in classrooms where professors spoke quickly and students answered with confidence, she struggled to keep up, scribbling notes, her mind racing, at times lost, at times frustrated, but never once allowing her pen to stop. And when the day ended, she sat on the campus bench, staring at her notes under the fading light, tears pressing against her eyes not because of failure but because she had survived the day she thought she could not. And when she returned that night to the mansion where she still worked part-time to cover her needs, she found Harrison waiting in the library, pretending to read but clearly watching the door. And when she entered with tired eyes and a faint smile, he asked nothing, only nodded as if he understood everything. And the silence between them was filled with a quiet pride she had never known before. And as weeks turned into months, the nights of studying grew longer, the weight of exhaustion heavier, but within her grew a strength that she had never recognized, a flame that had always been there but hidden under years of fear. And slowly, she began to raise her hand in class, her voice trembling at first, then steadier, until one day, a professor praised her insight in front of everyone, and the room that once felt like an enemy suddenly felt like a place where she could stand tall. And outside the classroom, she began helping other students, sharing her notes, explaining what she understood, building friendships she never thought possible. And still she never forgot the nights in the dark storage room, the rag in her hands, the sound of the world moving without her, for it reminded her of how far she had come. And through all of this, Harrison never treated her as anything other than equal, never reminded her of what she had been, only encouraged her toward what she could be. Until one evening, as they stood together in the grand hall where her journey had begun, he told her that the greatest wealth he had ever discovered was not money or success, but the chance to see someone else discover their true worth. And those words sank deep into her heart, becoming a truth she carried with her for the rest of her life. And years later, when she walked across the graduation stage, her gown flowing, her name called to thunderous applause, she searched the crowd until she found him, older now, but with the same calm pride in his eyes. And as their gazes met, she understood that this was not the end, but the true beginning, because she was no longer the girl cleaning floors in the dark, no longer the shadow hidden in corners, but a woman who had built herself on courage, faith, and the belief that one act of kindness could change the course of a life forever. And as she held her degree in her hands, she whispered a promise to herself that she would carry that kindness forward, so that no one lost in the dark would ever feel unseen again. And with that, the new beginning she had fought for became not just her story, but the start of many others yet to come.